B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, May 21st, 2020. A reminder, your humble host will be off tomorrow, Monday, for the Memorial Day holiday. And I plan to return on Tuesday, but that may shift. My partner, Kathy, is having shoulder surgery tomorrow. And my first priority for the next couple of weeks is caregiving to her. So, blockbuster audio that is clearly edited, maybe deceptively edited, maybe doctored is the correct term to use, has just been released in the U.S. by the Murdoch-owned New York Post. And it will be used to damage Democratic presidential prospective nominee Joe Biden. I'm going to play the recording for you in a moment. It's not that long. It relates to Ukraine. And earlier this week, I told you that Ukraine is coming back. And it will be used against Joe Biden in the fall campaign. And let me state at the outset here that this is a political hit piece. When you listen, you'll hear long gaps between Biden's side of the conversation and his counterpart, the former Ukrainian president, the Candyman, Petro Poroshenko. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the reaction to the release of this tape, which was conducted in Ukraine by an elected lawmaker whose name is Derkach, Andriy Derkach. Now, the negatives on him, as launched by people who are protesting this video, are that his daddy was in the KGB, that he is a Russian-aligned lawmaker, and that he has been some sort of a collaborator of Rudy Giuliani on his fact-finding missions in Ukraine. And so keep these factors in mind. And the next thing I want to point out is that there are things that I don't know about Joe Biden. When he was vice president, he was assigned the Ukraine portfolio. He was told to clean it up. And he has publicly bragged about how he dangled $1 billion over the leaders of Ukraine and said, if you don't get rid of this prosecutor, Viktor Shokin, I am not going to release this $1 billion. And just that has been used in the past by Trump to claim, as a counter to his perfect phone call with the subsequent president, Volodymyr Zelensky, that, hey, what's the problem? Biden threatened to withhold money. I didn't actually threaten to Zelensky. I did it behind his back. And so this is standard operating practice where the U.S. bullies nations to do its bidding. Now, the subtext from the attack line on Joe Biden is that he wanted Viktor Shokin fired because, allegedly, Shokin was investigating Burisma, the energy company where Hunter Biden had a fat cat perch on the board, and it yielded variously from $900,000 to over $1 million for a job where he was required to show up twice a year for meetings. And I've discussed the optics of that, how it's pretty stinky, and it is nepotism, either direct or indirect. Because Hunter Biden has ridden on his dad's coattails for his entire life. He was appointed to the board of Amtrak. And being a passenger was apparently his highest qualification for that job. And together with Joe Biden's brother, Hunter set himself up as a lobbyist and traded on his father's name. Now, it is sordid. It stinks. It looks bad. But it's not technically illegal. So, did Joe Biden force President Poroshenko to fire Viktor Shokin in order to help his son and Burisma, which was at one point under investigation. And in the minds of Americans, all this stuff happened at the same time, but when you actually break it out on a timeline, there is some distance. And I, for one, have not been able to build, based on what little I know, a direct case that says that Joe Biden did this to help Hunter. So listen to this recording. Again, it came from the Murdoch-owned New York Post. I'm sure it's all over the Fox News channel these days. And what I think you're going to hear is something that sounds really bad. And we have to ask ourselves whether it amounts to an important change in the story or an advance in the story, or whether this is simply a deceptively edited hack job to hurt Joe Biden. Oh, and the the newspaper, the New York Post, put it together with this zippy music, kind of a Fox News production value, that also serves to cover the gaps between Biden's side of the conversation and Poroshenko's. And we are told that the recording was made by Poroshenko. All right. With that, let's listen.
Assuming that there is a new government and a new prosecutor general, I am prepared to do a public signing of the commitment for the $1 billion.
Poroshenko can be heard defending the prosecutor general before saying he asked for his resignation.
Despite of the fact that we didn't have any corruption charges, we don't have any information about he doing something wrong, I especially asked him, it was the day before yesterday, I especially asked him to resign.
So Poroshenko delivers, if you believe this sequence.
Congratulations on installing the new prosecutor general. It's going to be critical for him to work quickly to repair the damage Shokin did. And I'm a man of my word. And that now that the new prosecutor general is in place, we're ready to move forward in signing that new $1 billion loan guarantee.
So there's more screen text here, and I've linked to the New York Post article with the recording, and it is enhanced with pictures of Poroshenko and Biden, but clearly they were not captured at the time of the communications. So it's a reconstruction with these damaging audio recordings, and it's not good for Joe Biden. There's no question about it. And as you know, I'm not a big fan of Joe Biden, and I've argued that even if the nexus here, all right, the linkage, the quid pro quo of Biden saying, I've got $1 billion, you get rid of Shokin. Shokin's gone, here comes $1 billion. Are they the same billion? I'll have to ask Paul Giamatti about that. So, borrowing a phrase from Donald Trump Jr., a spokesman for the Biden campaign, says they heavily edited this, and it's still a nothing burger that landed with a thud. So, this requires much more examination. And I turn to Britain's Guardian, where I'm highly skeptical of their coverage of Ukraine, of the way they cover officials in the U.S. government, particularly from the Obama administration. So they write that the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky, has said that leaked recordings of phone calls between Joe Biden and former President Poroshenko would be investigated by the country's law enforcement agencies, adding that their contents might be qualified as treason. Those remarks prompted an angry rebuttal from Poroshenko, who said that the Zelensky administration may have played a role in their release, and it should be investigated. Now, there's no love lost because Zelensky came from nowhere and defeated Poroshenko, who was backed by the United States and who was thought to be a shoo-in for re-election. Continuing to quote from The Guardian here, the recordings containing what appear to be heavily edited conversations between Biden and Poroshenko were published by a Ukrainian associate of Rudy Giuliani in an apparent attempt to embarrass the politicians and dent Biden's presidential run. Poroshenko called the leaked audio fabricated. A Biden spokesman said the comment about heavily edited nothing burger. Then this elected guy, Andriy Derkach, described by The Guardian as a Giuliani ally, claimed to have received the tapes from investigative journalists. Opponents have pointed at the lawmaker's ties to Russia. Derkach is a former MP for the pro-Russian Party of Regions faction. Oh, I guess he's not currently serving. He's a former. And he attended a KGB-run high school in Moscow. His father was a former KGB officer and then headed Ukraine's intelligence service. Now, as I read these, links to Russia, my eyebrows pop because The Guardian has promoted the whole Russiagate scenario that has been promoted by American media outlets, still without apology today, even as the main narrative has crashed and burned. And to be part of the Party of Regions faction, well, that puts him in cahoots with Paul Manafort and with the previous corrupt regime in Kiev. And all of this, of course, hits the addled American public, which has never had much interest and never gotten much meaningful coverage of the details of Ukrainian politics. And so it's easy to paint with a broad brush, oh, he's tied to Russia, and, there were always these linkages about, Russian-backed people in Ukraine. And certainly, there is an open war in Donbass, and there is strong tension, if not conflict, between Kiev and Moscow. But there's a lot of smoke, particularly to the low-information American public about Ukraine. So it remains to be seen how it's going to be played. But for pro-Trump Americans, this is going to be validation and vindication of his long-running claims that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election and that Hunter Biden was aided and abetted by Joe Biden in a corrupt father and son scheme. And, of course, we have to step back and look at the richness of that. As, the Trump kids are running daddy's empire, which he never put in a trust or distanced himself from, continues to profit from, and is likely more than peripherally involved. So we will see how this new bombshell rolls out and what other ammo Rudy Giuliani has. He has certainly been frightfully quiet for too long, and I'm sure that this is all timed to influence the November election. The Supreme Court has temporarily prevented the House of Representatives in its year-long quest to obtain the secret grand jury testimony from St. Bob Mueller's Russia investigation. And you can view this as collusion to protect Trump. In my view, the impeachment process, really, based on the precedent of Watergate, should have allowed the House investigators to review Mueller's grand jury testimony. And one can speculate that the Trump team thinks there's something in there that we shouldn't know about. I can equally speculate that Bob Mueller doesn't want all this stuff re-examined because his investigation was an embarrassment. So pretty clearly the court is moving to punt this beyond the November election, may try to do the same thing with the lawsuits demanding access to Trump's tax returns and other financial records. And once again, we can speculate, but we don't actually know if there are forces behind the scenes that led to these developments. It only takes the four of the 5 Republican appointees to the Supreme Court to punt this in the manner that the court has. And there is a troubling memo that has surfaced from the Bernie Sanders campaign. And as you know, he is planning to go to the Democratic National Convention in Milwaukee, if it's actually held, and press for progressive planks on the platform and other moves to reflect the political movement that he developed, the so-called political revolution. But he is requiring his delegates to sign a special agreement that you could call non-disparagement. And one of the elements of this agreement is that every delegate must agree to refrain from making negative statements about other candidates, party leaders, campaigns, campaign staffers, supporters, news organizations, or journalists. So this is a very broad gag order. This campaign is about the issues and finding solutions to America's problems. Our job is to differentiate the senator from his opponents, not through personal attacks. And then they have rules about using social media, that the delegates essentially are gagged from speaking to reporters. If they're contacted by a reporter, they're supposed to refer it to the campaign and say nothing. And that they must not disclose confidential or proprietary information obtained through your participation as a delegate. And that if you blurt something out or post it on social media, you must alert staff on the delegate's team to determine a course of action. Deleting something doesn't make it go away. So this is a troubling development. It's another effort at control. And in the 2016 coronation of Hillary Clinton, aided and abetted by Bernie Sanders, he had a hard time keeping his delegates in line. And there were strong reports of white noise machines that were placed over the sections of the convention hall where the concentration of Sanders supporters were located. And we know that Clinton supporters at strategic times drowned out some of the chorus of commentary coming from the rogue Bernie brothers. And this is just another disappointing development in Sanders' efforts to honor his commitment to support the eventual nominee. But Bernie, at what cost? Excellent op-ed by David Daley in the New York Times today. David Daley's appeared on this podcast several times. He's an expert on gerrymandering, and he's the one who got access to the Hofeller papers. Hofeller was the architect of the redistricting campaign by Republicans that have led to what appears to be majority rule, but it's all based on a minority of voters. Well, not all. I'm sure there's some states where they actually do have an actual majority. But Daley warns that there are new tactics afoot as we complete the 2020 census, which has been certainly impacted negatively by the coronavirus and its lockdown. And Republicans are turning to the courts with two strategies. One is they are challenging the voter-approved shift to public redistricting commissions, taking away the ability of elected officials to choose their voters and allowing voters to draw the maps. And we have that in California. It was one of the few achievements of Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor. I participated in the 2011 process related to my region, and I felt that our input was properly vetted and applied. And we know that other states, including Michigan, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Oregon, and Missouri, have used the initiative process to allow these kinds of public, nonpartisan commissions to draw the maps. And Daley points out that last week, Missouri lawmakers looked to dismantle the initiative in that state called Clean Missouri. It passed with 62% of the vote. And if Republicans have their way, the demographer, a nonpartisan state demographer, won't draw a single line, and control over the maps will be returned to a commission of party insiders. The new bill would add language to the state constitution to make it harder for Missouri citizens to gain legal standing to challenge a gerrymandered map in court. Voters living in districts intentionally packed with members of one political party would not be eligible to argue that their rights have been harmed by a statewide plan because they were still able to elect a member of their choosing within their own specific district, as the argument goes. And second, he says, under the new plan, if a legal challenge did make it into the courts, the state constitution would limit the remedies available to judges. A judge would not be able to throw out the entire state map as unconstitutional, but merely to order smaller changes to individual districts, essentially retaining most of the advantages embedded into the map by partisans. And guess who is helping advance this? Your friends at ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And another big change they're promoting is to shift from drawing districts based on the total population, as reflected in the census, and shifting only to a basis of the voting age population. And it was Tom Heffler who completed a study that showed, for example, in Texas, that such a move would pull power away from cities and toward older, rural populations, and would also, quoting Heffler, be advantageous to Republicans and non-Hispanic whites. And, you hear Trump tweeting away, railing against mail-in balloting, because he fears that it would undermine all of these kinds of schemes that have helped Republicans gain power, despite the fact that they are a net minority party. And this is an obscene abuse of a small d democratic process. Well, as you know, the effort to funnel money to individuals and organizations that truly need it because of the shutdowns due to the pandemic is largely benefiting large corporate entities. And today, a couple of senators fired off letters, Elizabeth Warren and Jack Reed, criticizing Delta Airlines and JetBlue for plans to cut employee hours despite receiving more than a total of $5 billion in government support as part of the payroll support program. And, they had their separate carve-out. I did report earlier this week that the money has not been pushed out to the airlines yet from the Treasury Department. And despite that, $25 billion in grants that were used to keep frontline workers like flight attendants, pilots, and mechanics on the job. And the other $25 billion or so was in the form of loans. They're not the only abusers of the handouts that they have received. You remember the Sackler family? They owned Purdue Pharma. They still do. Purdue Pharma was one of the big profiteers from OxyContin. And they promoted the use of opioids, claiming that, they were non-addictive. And they did incredible damage to our country. Well, one of the Sackler kids, Jonathan, owns an investment company called Coquino, LLC. And Coquino has received quite a bit of money here, $10 million in loan money intended to help small businesses struggling to stay afloat. And Coquino is not a drug company. Well, you decide if it's worse. It's an oil company. It's an oil infrastructure company. And Gulf Island Fabrication is the subsidiary that Coquino has a big stake in. So they applied for and got $10 million in federal money. And the question that comes up for me is, were they looking for a bailout because of the impact of COVID-19 or because of the collapse in oil markets this year, driven by a huge glut and a Russian-Saudi war over oil output and pricing? So with that in mind, I want to invite you over this long weekend, perhaps, to listen to my latest in-depth interview with young activists Adam Eichen and Andrew Perez. They are co-founders of a new organization called the Democracy Project, and their initial front is to take on some really disgusting elements of the Democratic-sponsored and Democratic-majority-passed House bill called the HEROES Act. It's the one with the $3 trillion price tag. It's got really good stuff in it. It extends unemployment benefits, including some benefits to non-citizens. It helps state and local government. It helps the highly impacted hospitals and other parts of the healthcare, not health insurance industry. But it also has a program that sets aside 25% of PPP funds, that's the Paycheck Protection Program, to support so-called nonprofits with less than 500 employees. But some of those nonprofits, as you'll hear from Andrew Perez here in a second, include the Republican-tilted U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the trade group called America's Health Insurance Plans, Big Pharma, and many other organizations. And the question is, why would Democrats insert a clause with bailout money that helps these essentially lobby groups that are diametrically opposed to the central elements of the Democratic agenda? Here's a comment about that from Andrew Perez.
We've been primarily focused on is a measure in the stimulus bill to expand the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP, to nonprofits. So it would actually expand it to all nonprofits, but it would create a special fund, a special pool of money for groups that have under 500 employees, which, it turns out is like most of them. It's almost all of them, especially in the trade association realm. 99.9% of trade associations have less than 500 employees. And that includes, most of the biggest names in Washington, most of the biggest lobbying groups there, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, like the biggest business lobby in the whole country, Pharma, the American Petroleum Institute, AHIP, the insurance lobby. There's just all of these groups are going to be considered small nonprofits, and they're going to be able to raid this small nonprofit fund that's, supposed to help groups that actually need it.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Andrew Perez and Adam Eichen. It's available for my subscribers right now at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And I think you'll find it fascinating. If you're so moved, you can join their new organization called the Democracy Project. And I don't have trillions of dollars to pass out, but with a lot of generous support from listeners of the Peter B. Collins podcast, we have our own community fund making available $100 grants to listeners and people they know who need a help out at this difficult time. And so if you or someone close to you is hitting the wall financially where $100 would help fill a gas tank, buy some groceries, or otherwise ease the shortcomings, the shortfall in their bank accounts, please get in touch. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com. We are funded due to the generosity of listeners. And we invite you to apply for a grant today. And as we've mentioned, you do not have to be located in the United States. There's impact worldwide, and our generosity doesn't end at the U.S. border. So today, President Trump announced his plans to visit Ypsilanti, Michigan, just outside of Ann Arbor and Detroit, the site of a Ford plant that was converted to making ventilators. And the rules are clear that visitors to this Ford plant are required to wear a face covering. And just before I sat down to record, I glanced at the headlines. Trump has made his visit, and he ignored the gentle reminder that came from Michigan state officials in the form of Attorney General Dana Nessel. And she said, look, we're just asking that Trump comply with the law in our state, just as we would make the same request of anyone else in those plants. So Trump is too cool for that. Might, the orange tint on his face, I don't know whether it's a chemical compound or a powder or whatever it is, but, it might rub off on the mask, and then when he pulls it off, his skin would look different, and he couldn't handle that. Anyway, Nessel said if he fails to wear a mask, he's going to be asked not to return to any enclosed facility inside our state. I know that Ford has asked him to do the same thing, but if we know that he's coming to our state and we know that he's not going to follow the law, I think we're going to have to take action against any company or facility that allows him inside those facilities and puts workers at risk. But I'm sure Trump believes that the rules don't apply to him, that he, of course, is on the hydroxy, and he's tested positive in a testing system with a high false reporting rate, and that everything is just going to be great. Separately, the mayor of Baltimore is asking Trump not to visit Fort McHenry on Monday in honor of Memorial Day because the city remains under a stay-at-home order, and she'd like him to stay at home, too. You can tell I added that last part. I don't know that he will honor that, just like everything else. Also, there's a new survey, and it's gotten lost in my pack of papers here. Here it is. That American social media users think that Trump should be banned or suspended from platforms for spreading false information about coronavirus. Well, it only recently started there. He's been lying on Twitter and using it as an attack platform without any sanction from Jack Dorsey and the Twitter company. 37% say he should be banned, and 36% say he should be temporarily suspended. Now, Trump, unmasked, sets a bad example. There is a Republican in the Illinois state legislature who was tossed out of a session on Wednesday after he refused to wear a face mask. His name is Darren Bailey, and by a vote of 81 to 27, they bounced him. Well, he stormed, I cannot sit in there and be part of just a puppet game. But Governor Pritzker said the representative has shown a callous disregard for life, callous disregard for people's health. Clearly, the representative has no interest in protecting others. And even the Republican General Assembly leader, Jim Durkin, said we cannot ignore or compromise the health and safety of every member in the General Assembly. So that's a bit of a shift. Here's today's COVID-19 update, research by Linda Lewis. The worldwide death count attributed to the coronavirus now stands at 329,000. We have passed 93,000 here in the United States. And there are a number of news items related to the coronavirus. A new study coming from Columbia University, and this is based on a model, but they argue that if the United States had started social distancing just 1 week earlier than it did, that we could have prevented the loss of at least 36,000 lives. It spread that fast in a single week. Now, the Columbia team used a model that depicts the transmission throughout the United States, and the peak or critical period started on March 15th. Also, CBS News is reporting that OSHA is basically AWOL. They're not on the job protecting workers. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration has basically turned a blind eye to the meatpacking industry, offering lame recommendations that are considered advisory, but clearly not a standard or regulation, and that their efforts to, advise particularly meatpacking companies on protecting their workers, they undermine them by saying they create no new legal obligations. However, there is a long-standing obligation that employers must follow a law known as the General Duty Clause, that companies must provide a workplace free of recognized hazards. Now, critics say the rule is unlikely to be enforced, especially after Trump invoked the Defense Production Act to force meatpacking plants to remain open, and the employers had no problem with that, of course, because they consider their workers disposable. In fact, I would cynically argue that they think that a side of beef rolling down the line is more valuable than the average employee who's slicing it up. Shortly before Trump's order, state regulators in Iowa declined to inspect a Tyson Foods pork plant, despite a complaint alleging workers had been exposed to the virus in crowded conditions, and a week later, 60% of the workforce had tested positive. Also, at a Tyson plant near, it's in Kansas, the state softened its quarantine guidelines after industry executives pushed to allow potentially exposed employees to continue going to work. And when you ask the USDA, they go all stooges on you, and they point fingers at OSHA, which just says, huh? Maybe you saw the news clip on TV last night, but Ron DeSantis, he's auditioning to be a future Trump. He's currently the governor of Florida. And Mike Pence stood by and gave him moral support as he flatly lied on TV. So we reported to you earlier this week about a woman named Rebecca Jones, and she was building the dashboard with all the coronavirus data in Florida when she went public and said, they're making me massage the data. But the counterattack from DeSantis, she's not a data scientist. She's somebody that has a degree in journalism and communication and geography. She's not involved in collating any data, nor does she have the expertise to do that. And then he went for the National Enquirer smear. She's also under active criminal charges in the state of Florida for cyberstalking and cybersexual harassment. I asked the Department of Health to explain to me how someone would be allowed to be charged with that and continue on. Now, there apparently are court records, according to this news account, which is from Politico, showing that Jones is facing a criminal stalking charge. Well, that's a cheap shot. And you kill the messenger when you can't deal with the message. Over at The Atlantic, which is increasingly right-wing, there is an attack on the Center for Disease Control. And it does have some resonance here. The Atlantic is reporting that the CDC is making a debilitating mistake, combining test results that diagnose current coronavirus infections with test results that measure whether someone has ever had the virus. So you know the difference, right, between the test to see if you have the virus, even if you're not showing symptoms, and antibody tests, which are not considered highly reliable at this point, but would show that if you'd had the disease pass through your body with or without symptoms at some time in the recent past. And this is part of a larger pattern of meddling with the numbers. And it leaves us with unreliable data to measure whether, for example, the early states like Georgia and Florida that so-called reopened, just how much of a risk did they take related to potential future infections of their populations? So Texas, Georgia, and Vermont, they're all blending their data. And part of it appears to be able to brag about how, we've done 40 billion tests or 18 gazillion tests. But by mixing the two, it does not offer transparent data to the public, and it ultimately, I think, will corrupt forensic efforts to analyze how it spread and to what extent the data can be relied upon. And this gets into arguments that people have about the number of cases that come out of testing. And, of course, this is a variable based on how many tests you take. And initially, not very many people were being tested, and so there appeared to be a higher fatality rate. And the people who oppose the lockdown and who question the whole pandemic as a hysterical response, they like to massage that data themselves and say, look, the more you test, the more you find. And then there's Trump, who wants to diminish or contain the number of tests in an effort just to keep devastating numbers to a minimum. You know about the 2 dams that burst and have flooded the city of Midland in Michigan? Well, one of the problems in the effort to deal with those who are displaced from their homes is that they're being taken to shelters where it's very difficult to avoid transmission of the virus. And they're doing what they can in shelters. They're keeping the beds 6 feet apart and doing a lot of cleaning, and people have to wear masks. But flooding is not the only issue. Here in California, we have concerns about a wildfire season based on a winter where there was enough rain to grow the fuel, and it will be dried out by mid-June with an extended fire season all the way into the end of October, or perhaps into early November. There is other news from beyond our borders. China is moving to impose new security laws in Hong Kong that I think could lead to new protests. And the effort is to impose new national security laws that would give the Communist Party more control over Hong Kong. And the Beijing view is that these laws are necessary to protect China's sovereignty from external forces. And it is an open question. How much of the protesting has been purely organic and led by people in Hong Kong, and how much of it may have been stoked by the United States or other external actors? That in no way justifies the crackdown, and it's tragic to see how Hong Kong was handed off by Britain to Beijing with assurances of a separate form of governance reflecting the freedom and participation that Hong Kong citizens had had under British rule. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas says that his government, the Palestinian Authority, will no longer be committed to signed agreements with Israel or the United States. This is in retaliation to the U.S.-backed plan for Israel to annex parts of the occupied West Bank as early as July. That is, if Netanyahu can get past his corruption trial. The latest twist is that Bibi Netanyahu said that he didn't want to come to the opening session of his trial, which begins on Sunday, because, he'd have to bring all his bodyguards, and that would violate the protocols for social distancing because of COVID-19. This guy will go to any lengths to avoid accountability. At any rate, this move by the Palestinians, I think, sets the stage for potential deep conflicts, perhaps as soon as the annexation moves forward. So the Palestinians aren't the only people who are making a move like that. The Trump administration announced today it is planning to withdraw from another major arms control agreement. This is related to Russia, but there are, I think, 34 nations that agreed to the Open Skies Treaty going back 30 years ago. And it allows nations to fly over each other's territory with specific gear to assure that other nations are not preparing for military action. Now, this brings up a number of questions, because this has been in effect for 30 years, and the Trump administration says that Russia has breached the agreement. They have violated the Open Skies Treaty. But one of the examples of that was an overflight of one of Trump's resorts, the Bedminster Golf Club, where he spends time when he's not at Mar-a-Lago and when he's out of the White House playing golf. And Trump is so petty that you cannot dismiss the possibility that he wants to bail out on this treaty just for that reason. Now, he's got advisors who say, oh, no, Russia has been not just looking at military installations, but they have been, doing a lot of surveillance of American infrastructure. Well, for Christ's sake, they've got satellites to do that, and they've got Google Earth. And so I'm not deeply enough steeped in the arcane details of the Open Skies Agreement, but those are my questions for now. The New York Times got behind the scenes with more of those insider sources at the White House and did an interesting piece today under the bylines of Julian Barnes and Adam Goldman about what it's like to try to brief Donald Trump. And this arises from his attacks on a single briefing that he says occurred on January 23rd, when he was told, yeah, there's a COVID, but it's not a big deal. And intelligence officials have identified his briefer as a 56-year-old CIA analyst named Beth Sanner, and that she has developed a special relationship, has figured out how to brief Donald Trump and deal with his limited attention span. She loads it up with charts and graphs and satellite photos. They don't mention videos, but I'm sure he would love to see an iPad with secret video reports on it. Anyway, it's an interesting look. They say that the first briefer, a guy named Ted Gestaro, got burnt out trying to keep Trump's attention, and that Ms. Sanner has figured out how to keep his attention and bring him back when he goes off on his rants that are fed by Fox News and phone calls with his friends. Well, there is a new chief of national intelligence. As of today, the Senate narrowly confirmed the highly partisan Trump loyalist, Congressman John Ratcliffe of Texas. This is despite his very limited experience, doubts about his resume, padded a bit when he was a federal prosecutor in Texas. But it appears what turned the tide was when Trump fired Joseph McGuire, who was the previous acting chief of intelligence, and replaced him with the interim acting director of national intelligence, Mark Grinnell. He's the guy who did Trump's dirty work and released the list of people who requested unmasking of Mike Flynn. And so it appears that the Republicans felt that the devil they know, Ratcliffe, is preferable to the temporary director, who they never had a chance to interview for the job. The Senate separate committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, also has approved on a 12-10 party line vote, which means that it'll go to the floor and get rubber stamped by the Republican majority, the nomination of Michael Pack, who is a right-wing propagandist, to run the State Department's Agency for Global Media, the official U.S. international propaganda agency. And this just gets into layers of bullshit, really. As I've talked about this before, I don't know that people pay attention to Radio Free Europe, Radio Marti in Cuba, Al-Hura in the Middle East. But what has been described, of course falsely in the past, as a neutral organization that just shares news about the United States with hungry, pro-democratic listeners and viewers across the world, well, it's now securely in control of a Fox News kind of guy. Over at Consortium News today, I recommend the article that describes the British Chancellor, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sajid Javid, who signed the extradition orders for Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. So he served as the Home Secretary from April 2018 to July 2019. I think that's in the Theresa May administration. But he also attended a series of annual secret meetings with spooks and military figures at a 5-star island resort off the coast of Georgia. That's the American Georgia. And at these meetings, there were panel discussions where people called for the neutralization of Julian Assange. Elliot Abrams was on a panel with Javid in 2018. Also, Fred Kagan, the senior American Enterprise Institute staffer. And the descriptions of these meetings is interesting. But it does show that Javid was at least tight with and probably influenced by those in the American establishment who most wanted to stop the efforts of Julian Assange because they were just so damn inconvenient. And here's a really ugly case of so-called American justice. You may know the name Stephen Donziger. He was the attorney who at one point had successfully won a lawsuit against Chevron for Texaco, which Chevron absorbed, for Texaco's deep pollution of wetlands in Ecuador. And perhaps you know this is a long-running case. He won a $9 billion judgment against Chevron/Texaco. And right now he's under house arrest in New York for contempt of court because he refused to give up his cell phone and computer to a court. It's a federal court. And the article at The Intercept under the byline of Sharon Lerner explains that because his trial has been moved to September and the judge will not free him from the ankle bracelet that he has to wear, that he will have spent 13 months in home detention awaiting trial on charges that carry a maximum sentence of 6 months. And in the article, she also recounts how Chevron has used the legal process to bleed Donziger, to keep him in court on various legal challenges, and that every time Donziger tries to get a jury trial, Chevron will pull a fast one, avoiding it at all costs. This week, Republicans voted by mail in Oregon. Well, so did the Democrats, but the Republicans, of course, rubber-stamped Trump for re-election. But they also made a curious choice of Joe Ray Perkins to challenge Senator Jeff Merkley in the fall. Perkins was carrying about 50% of the vote in the tabulation that probably isn't complete yet. And she's being dinged for her open support of QAnon. And I have to say that I've never been to 4chan, I don't hang at Reddit, and I don't know much about QAnon. But people do send me stuff that they say is endorsed by Q. And some of it appeals to my bias about a deep state, about a Russiagate plot aimed at getting Trump out of office. And they also invoke some things that are partially true, like the penchant of some Washington officials for sex with children. But it appears to all be thrown in a Cuisinart of some sort and come out as conspiracy theories that even I, can't entertain. So we'll see how Ms. Perkins fares against Jeff Merkley, who's a pretty decent senator. And finally today, we don't know any names here, but back in February, on a flight from L.A. to Newark, there was an African-American NFL player. And he was in a middle or aisle seat in the same row with a white, middle-aged female passenger who had the window seat. And because the NFL player, and it's not clear if the other man in the picture was his friend or just happened to be black and sitting in the same row, but the two men report that the woman first harassed the men because they were wearing face masks. And the woman reportedly repeatedly asked them to take off their masks. And then she got touchy. And she ended up groping the penis of the NFL player. In the language of the lawsuit, assailant accosted John Doe 1 and told him he was frightening, ordered him to move to the front and use the air in the front of the plane because he was sick, and questioned why John Doe 1 had a mask on. John Doe 1 respectfully responded that he was not sick and was being proactive, especially in the wake of growing COVID-19 concerns. The woman then started to grope and massage the player's knees and thighs. Fearful of the perception of being a male victim and the racial stigma of being a young African-American male, John Doe 1 pleaded patiently for the assailant to stop and remove her hand. Oh, he removed her hand. The woman then reached inside the player's jacket, caressed his chest. And when he got up to complain to flight attendants, she began grabbing the leg and groin area of the other plaintiff. And United, which is accused of not naming the passenger, not being willing to identify the flight attendants who were participating in the attempted resolution of this problem, well, they're being sued, and so far they've given the men $150 vouchers to take another flight on United. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. I'll return sometime next week. You can find this on YouTube, and I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.